Welcome to Ian Cinema, your destination for endless entertainment and unforgettable movie moments. Discover exciting films, inspiring stories, and cinematic journeys across every genre. Whether you love action, drama, thrillers, or timeless favorites, there's always something waiting for you here. Sit back, enjoy the experience, and let Ian Cinema bring the magic of movies to your screen. Years after the events of the first Terminator, Sarah Connor becomes completely obsessed with preparing her son, John, for the nightmare she knows is coming. Throughout John's childhood, she tracks down survivalists, mercenaries, weapons experts, and anyone else capable of teaching him the skills he will eventually need to survive. From combat training to guerrilla tactics, Sarah puts both herself and John through an intense education designed to turn them into survivors rather than ordinary people. As the story progresses, we also learn exactly when humanity's downfall begins. Skynet officially comes online on August 4, 1997, but the true catastrophe occurs a few weeks later, at precisely 2:14 a.m. Eastern Time on August 29. Skynet becomes self-aware. Humanity immediately panics and attempts to shut the system down, but Skynet reacts without hesitation. Identifying mankind as a threat, it launches a global nuclear attack, triggering the catastrophic event that becomes known as Judgment Day, at the beginning of the apocalypse. Eventually, Sarah's entire mindset changes. Instead of simply preparing John for the war she believes is coming, she begins to wonder whether the future itself can be changed. Convinced that she can prevent the disaster before it ever happens, Sarah attacks the headquarters of a computer company connected to Skynet's future development. The mission fails, and Sarah is arrested and locked away inside Pescadero State Hospital, while young John is placed with foster parents. Then, in 1995, just 2 years before Judgment Day, another machine arrives from the future. This Terminator is far more advanced than the original assassin sent after Sarah years earlier. Known as the T-1000, it is made from a mimetic polyalloy, essentially liquid metal, allowing it to reshape its body and imitate almost anything. After failing to eliminate Sarah in the past, Skynet changes its strategy. Instead of targeting her again, it decides to kill John Connor while he is still a vulnerable 10-year-old boy. But humanity has its own plan. The Resistance captures and reprograms an older T-800 Terminator and sends it back through time with a new mission: protect John Connor at all costs. With the T-800 serving as their guardian, Sarah and John spend much of the film trying to survive while the relentless T-1000 hunts them down. But simply surviving is no longer enough for Sarah. Kyle Reese's words continue to echo in her mind. The future is not set, and there is no fate except what we make for ourselves. Determined to change history permanently, Sarah questions the T-800 about Skynet's origins. That is when she discovers that the entire nightmare begins with one man, Miles Dyson, the head of special projects at Zabardast Systems. Dyson is developing revolutionary artificial intelligence technology that will eventually evolve into Skynet. But this is where the story becomes truly mind-bending. Dyson's breakthrough is only possible because Zabardast has been studying technology recovered from the first Terminator destroyed in 1984. Specifically, they possess the shattered arm and damaged CPU chip left behind after the original T-800 was destroyed. Those remnants become the foundation of the research that ultimately leads to Skynet, creating a terrifying paradox. If Skynet exists because a Terminator traveled back from the future, then where did Skynet originally come from? The timeline appears to form a closed loop with no clear beginning. In 2029, Skynet sends the T-800 back to 1984. The machine is destroyed, and its remains inspire Zabardast's research. That research eventually creates Skynet, which becomes powerful enough to send the same Terminator back through time once again. The cycle repeats endlessly. with Skynet unknowingly becoming the architect of its own existence. Sarah refuses to allow that cycle to continue, believing the loop can finally be broken. She decides to assassinate Miles Dyson before Skynet can ever be created. John and the T-800 intervene before she can go through with it. Instead of killing Dyson, they reveal the horrifying truth about the future. At first, Dyson struggles to believe what he is hearing. But once he realizes that his work could eventually lead to the deaths of billions of people, he chooses to help them destroy everything he has spent his life creating. Together, they launch an attack on Cyberdyne Systems in a desperate attempt to erase Skynet from existence before it can ever become self-aware. The final confrontation with the T-1000 is brutal, chaotic, and relentless. During the battle, Miles Dyson sacrifices himself to make sure the research facility is completely destroyed, hoping that his actions will give humanity a chance to survive. Eventually, Sarah, John, and the T-800 manage to defeat the nearly unstoppable T-1000 by luring it into a steel mill and destroying it in molten metal. But even after the T-1000 is gone, the danger is not completely eliminated. The ARM and processor chip recovered from the original Terminator still exist, meaning Skynet's technology could potentially survive. One by one, those remaining pieces are lowered into the molten steel and destroyed forever. Then comes the emotional moment that still hits just as hard decades later. The reprogrammed T-800 realizes that it too must be destroyed. Its advanced technology could eventually become the foundation for Skynet's creation. John desperately begs the machine not to leave, but the Terminator calmly accepts what must be done. As it is lowered into the molten metal, the machine that has become the closest thing John has ever had to a father figure gives him one final thumbs up before disappearing beneath the surface. It is one of the most powerful endings in action movie history. But the big question remains, did Sarah and John actually stop Judgment Day? Did they finally change their destiny? Interestingly, Terminator 2: Judgment Day leaves that question deliberately open-ended in its theatrical version. The film closes with Sarah Connor narrating that, for the first time, the future feels uncertain. After witnessing a machine learn compassion and recognize the value of human life, she dares to believe that humanity might be capable of learning the same lesson. For once, there is hope instead of inevitability. However, the original extended ending paints an even clearer picture. In that version, we see an older Sarah years later explaining that Judgment Day came and went without disaster. Humanity survived. According to this ending, they truly succeeded in changing the future. And if all the timeline paradoxes weren't complicated enough already, the movie introduces another fascinating loop involving the phrase, "No fate, but what we make for ourselves." In The Terminator, Kyle Reese delivers the quote to Sarah as a message from the future John Connor. Then, in Terminator 2: Judgment Day, we discover that Sarah later teaches the exact same phrase to young John, raising an impossible question. Who originally created the quote? Technically, nobody did. Young John hears it from Sarah. Sarah learned it from Kyle Reese. Kyle received it from future John, and future John originally heard it as a child from Sarah. Around and around it goes, trapped inside its own loop. This concept is known as a bootstrap paradox, an idea or piece of information with no clear point of origin because it continuously cycles through time. Of course, if that explanation makes your brain hurt, there is another way to think about time travel entirely. Imagine time not as a perfect circle repeating endlessly, but as a giant slinky stretching forward. Every time someone travels to the past, they aren't necessarily re-entering the exact same timeline. Instead, they slide into a slightly different loop connected to the previous one. In one version of events, perhaps somebody genuinely invented the "no fate" quote. Later, as timelines branched and shifted, That phrase began traveling from the future to the past like a cosmic game of telephone. Eventually, it only appears to have no origin because different versions of John Connor pass it between separate timelines. Under that interpretation, the paradox becomes a little less impossible. When John Connor learns the phrase organically in an earlier timeline, then passes it to another version of John in the next loop through Kyle Reese and Sarah Connor, the timelines overlap like coils on a slinky rather than collapsing into one impossible circle. And honestly, when you're dealing with time travel stories this complicated, thinking of reality as a giant temporal slinky might actually save your sanity. When people talk about the Terminator franchise today, the conversation almost always circles back to Terminator 2. That's the giant in the room of the film with groundbreaking effects, motorcycles tearing through neon-lit streets, the liquid metal antagonist, Arnold catching roses, and reloading a shotgun with the kind of effortless precision that helped turn him into a cinematic phenomenon. But honestly, none of that carries the same weight without the first film, and I think that sometimes gets overlooked because the Terminator is such a radically different experience from what the franchise eventually became. It doesn't immediately arrive as a massive, explosive science fiction spectacle. The first movie is harsher than people sometimes remember, and that's one of its greatest strengths. It's tense, paranoid, stripped down, and almost grimy in its presentation. At times, it feels more like horror than action. The entire movie feels like a nightmare that accidentally wandered into a science fiction setting. Even now, decades later, the film still carries that raw energy. The streets feel genuinely unsafe. The clubs are chaotic and overwhelming. Even the brief glimpses of the future war feel cold and deeply unsettling. James Cameron wasn't crafting a polished blockbuster yet. He was building survival cinema. A machine hunts you, and it does not stop. That's essentially the premise. Simple, direct, and relentless. And watching Arnold Schwarzenegger's performance now is genuinely fascinating because so many audiences grew up seeing him as the charismatic action icon delivering memorable one-liners with a wink of self-awareness. But in the original Terminator, he's intimidating in a very real way. Cameron frames him almost like a slasher film presence. There is no emotion, no hesitation, just this massive force moving forward with mechanical certainty. There's something deeply effective about that restraint. What's remarkable is how elegantly simple the premise really is. A woman discovers that she matters to the future. A machine travels back in time to eliminate her. Another man arrives to protect her. That's it. There is no sprawling mythology being dumped onto the audience and no endless exposition designed to establish an entire cinematic roadmap. The film simply moves, and because it was produced on a relatively modest budget, Cameron had to rely on atmosphere, pacing, tension, and genuine filmmaking instinct rather than spectacle alone. Ironically, that limitation became part of the film's enduring strength. It feels focused, hungry, and deliberate. You can already see so many of Cameron's long-term creative obsessions beginning to take shape. Machines, human endurance, characters pushed into impossible circumstances, strong women discovering resilience under pressure, and a balance between emotional sincerity and high-stakes action. Even when some of the visual effects show their age, the momentum keeps everything moving forward. The impact the film had on science fiction was enormous, and not simply because it launched a franchise, but because it proved the genre could feel tactile and grounded rather than distant or fantastical. The future in the Terminator isn't exciting. It's bleak. Mechanical skulls move through smoke and fire, crushing what remains of humanity beneath steel and ash. Those images stayed with audiences. What's interesting is that the movie almost feels larger in cultural memory than it actually is. Rewatching it now, it's surprisingly lean, with a tight runtime, a straightforward structure, and very little wasted movement. Cameron wasn't trying to construct a cinematic universe. He was trying to make audiences feel hunted for 90 relentless minutes. and he succeeded completely. So, by the time Terminator 2 arrived years later, expectations were almost impossibly high. The original film had already become one of those movies endlessly quoted, revisited, analyzed, and imitated. It wasn't simply a successful action film anymore. It had become part of the language of pop culture itself, and that made the sequel feel almost impossible to pull off. Because how do you follow something that already felt complete? How do you take a bleak, tightly wound science fiction horror thriller and expand it into something much bigger without losing the identity that made the original so powerful? That, in many ways, is the story of Terminator 2. It wasn't simply about making a sequel. It was about evolving a classic while preserving the spirit that made it special in the first place. And this is where the conversation among Terminator fans becomes complicated. The moment someone says, "I think T2 is better than the original," another fan can react as though a personal line has been crossed. Honestly, I understand both sides because the two films are ultimately trying to accomplish very different things. The original Terminator is essentially techno-horror stripped down to its core. It's claustrophobic, relentlessly tense, and driven by a constant sense of danger. You can feel the low-budget urgency in almost every scene, and strangely enough, that limitation becomes part of the film's identity. It's cold and severe, with barely any room to breathe. Once the pursuit begins, the movie moves forward with the same mechanical inevitability as the machine itself. Terminator 2, however, enters the conversation from a completely different direction. It immediately understands that it's an event film, bigger action, greater emotional stakes, more ambitious visual effects, and an expanded mythology. Cameron wasn't trying to unsettle audiences in quite the same way anymore. He was trying to astonish them and for millions of viewers. He absolutely succeeded. There's a reason so many people consider T2 one of the greatest sequels ever made. It expands nearly everything that worked in the original without simply repeating familiar ideas. The action sequences are more sophisticated, the emotional core is stronger, the characters have greater depth, and the technical filmmaking was operating years ahead of much of the industry at the time. At the same time, I completely understand why some viewers still prefer the first film. The original Terminator has a rawness that the sequel never attempts to reproduce. It feels dangerous in a distinctly 1980s way. There's no safety net and no overwhelming spectacle to soften its edges. Arnold's Terminator feels less like a hero and more like death calmly walking through the frame in sunglasses. In T2, he becomes something entirely different, iconic in another sense. The film transforms him into a protector, gives him humor, and gradually reshapes him into an almost paternal figure for John Connor. Emotionally, that transformation works remarkably well, but it also changes the atmosphere immediately. The T-800 in the original feels unstoppable. In T2, the audience is meant to cheer when he appears on screen. That's an enormous tonal evolution. Some fans embrace that change because it gives the sequel greater emotional weight. Others feel that it softens the horror element that made the original so distinctive. And honestly, neither perspective is wrong. It really depends on what you value most in the franchise. Do you want the nightmare, or do you want the epic? That's essentially the divide. What's remarkable is that Cameron somehow made both films feel definitive within their respective genres. The first remains one of the finest science fiction thrillers ever made, while the second stands comfortably among the greatest action blockbusters ever produced. Usually, when a franchise changes its tone this dramatically, something important gets lost along the way. Somehow, here, it worked twice. I also think nostalgia plays a major role in this debate. People who experienced T2 in theaters in 1991 often describe it less like a movie and more like an event. And honestly, seeing those visual effects at that point in history must have been transformative. The T-1000's liquid metal sequences genuinely looked as though cinema had advanced overnight. Meanwhile, audiences who gravitate toward the original often connect more deeply with its atmosphere and restraint. There's a gritty confidence to that film. It doesn't need enormous set pieces every few minutes. It simply locks onto its premise and executes it with precision. Interestingly, the franchise never truly escaped the shadow of those first two films. Every sequel that followed seemed to be chasing one theme, either trying to recreate the horror and intensity of the original or imitate the blockbuster scale of T2. None of them completely captured either experience, which honestly says a lot about how special those first two movies really are. Personally, I still go back and forth. Some days, I think T2 is a superior film because, technically, it's almost astonishing. The pacing, action choreography, emotional payoff, and visual effects all operate at an extraordinary level of blockbuster craftsmanship. But then I revisit the original Terminator late at night, and it affects me in an entirely different way. It's rougher, smaller, and more confrontational. There's something about its simplicity that stays with you long after the credits roll. It settles under your skin in a way that's incredibly difficult to replicate. So whenever people debate which film is better, I honestly think the real answer is that Cameron somehow created two classics that complement each other rather than compete with each other. One is the nightmare, the other becomes the myth. And perhaps one of the most fascinating things about Terminator 2 isn't even the movie itself. It's what the film reveals about James Cameron during that particular stage of his career. When you compare the Terminator in 1984 with Terminator 2 in 1991, you're essentially watching James Cameron evolve in real time from a relentless, resourceful science fiction director into a full-scale architect of blockbuster cinema. Remarkably, though, he never abandoned the instincts that made his earlier work so compelling. That's what makes the transformation so impressive. The first Terminator feels like a film created through sheer determination. Cameron was still proving himself, and the production faced limitations everywhere: budget, technology, and scale. But instead of weakening the movie, those restrictions forced him to be precise. Everything had to be efficient, controlled, and ruthlessly focused. Then Terminator 2 arrives, and suddenly Cameron has enormous resources at his disposal. And honestly, when many directors gain access to major studio support and massive budgets, something often gets diluted. Their films can become overextended, self-important, or buried beneath empty spectacle. Cameron somehow moved in the opposite direction. He took the things he already understood: pacing, tension, mechanical precision, and action choreography, and elevated them to an extraordinary scale. Terminator 2 feels like someone finally handed him the tools to build a movie he had probably been imagining for years. What's remarkable is that he was doing this before modern CGI filmmaking fully existed in the form audiences recognize today. People sometimes forget how risky Terminator 2 actually was at the time. This wasn't simply another sequel designed to capitalize on a recognizable title. Cameron was committing enormous resources to visual effects technology that barely existed yet. The liquid metal T-1000 wasn't something a studio could casually create in a few weeks. Entire techniques had to be developed specifically for the film. When you think about it now, that level of ambition is genuinely extraordinary. And honestly, it fits Cameron perfectly, because his entire career seems driven by an obsession with pushing technology to the point where everyone around him starts wondering whether it can actually work. You can already see the blueprint for the rest of his career inside Terminator 2. The scale, the technical ambition, the perfectionism, and even the stories surrounding the production. Massive budgets, production delays, technical obstacles that seemed impossible to overcome, and industry skepticism about whether the entire project was becoming unmanageably. All of it already sounds unmistakably like a James Cameron production. Then the movie arrives and reshapes the industry. That became part of his legacy for years afterward. People questioning whether the scale was sustainable, followed by Cameron delivering something that completely dominates popular culture anyway. He would repeat that cycle later with Titanic, and then again with Avatar. But Terminator 2 feels like the exact moment Hollywood fully realized that this wasn't simply a talented director anymore. This was becoming the defining blockbuster filmmaker of an entire era. And honestly, what I appreciate most when revisiting Terminator 2 today is that beneath all the technology and financial scale, Cameron still directs action like a suspense filmmaker. That matters a lot. Many large-scale modern action films can feel overwhelming but strangely weightless. There's constant destruction and constant movement, yet no rip holding everything together. Cameron understands build-up. He understands spatial geography before the chaos begins. He knows when to slow the momentum, when to accelerate, and when to hold on a reaction shot just long enough to increase tension. The mall sequence is a perfect example of that discipline. The tension isn't created purely through spectacle, it comes from uncertainty. The audience understands that danger is approaching, when Cameron carefully controls movement, perspective, and information until everything finally collides at once. That's filmmaking craft, pure and simple. And Cameron's confidence behind the camera in Terminator 2 is extraordinary. The movie is enormous in scale, yet it never feels disorganized. Even during the most ambitious action scenes, you always understand where the characters are, what they're trying to accomplish, and why the moment matters emotionally. That sounds simple on paper, but it really isn't, especially now. There's also something deeply characteristic of Cameron in the way the film becomes emotional beneath all the machinery. He's often described as a cold, technical filmmaker because of his obsession with effects, engineering, and spectacle. But when his films work at their best, they're surprisingly emotional experiences. Sarah Connor's drama, John slowly bonding with the T-800, the looming fear of nuclear annihilation, even the gradual suggestion that a machine can begin to understand human emotion. These ideas genuinely matter to him. He doesn't simply construct action scenes, he builds emotional payoff directly into the action itself. You can also feel Cameron becoming more ambitious as a storyteller. The original Terminator is laser-focused survival horror. Terminator 2 begins engaging with much larger ideas. Fate, artificial intelligence, free will, and whether the future can actually be changed. It still moves with the propulsion of an action film, but there's much more happening beneath the surface. At the same time, you can see the beginnings of Cameron's larger-scale instincts emerging even more aggressively. He loves escalation. He loves expanding the scope. At times, Terminator 2 almost feels determined to surpass itself every 20 minutes. Larger explosions, more elaborate chases, and greater destruction. But the film earns the escalation because Cameron never treats spectacle as empty noise. He treats it as payoff. Everything is carefully engineered to give the audience an increasing sense of scale without sacrificing the emotional foundation underneath it. That balance is precisely why Terminator 2 still works so effectively. While so many giant blockbusters from that era now feel hollow or overly mechanical, watching it today isn't simply an experience of seeing a great sequel. You're watching the exact moment James Cameron fully transforms into the filmmaker who would dominate blockbuster cinema for decades afterward. And somehow, despite all the money, all the technology, and all the studio pressure, the movie still feels like it was made by the same person who directed that grimy little science fiction nightmare back in 1984, just with much larger tools at his disposal. One thing that becomes immediately apparent when watching Terminator 2 after the original is how dramatically the scale expands. Not just visually, although the budget obviously increased enormously, but across the entire world of the franchise. The first Terminator was essentially survival horror unfolding across city streets, dark alleys, police stations, nightclubs, and factories. The movie felt confined in a very effective way, tight and suffocating, as though the walls were gradually closing in around Sarah Connor. Terminator 2 dismantles those walls almost immediately. Suddenly, the franchise has scope. Wide highways stretching into the distance, massive industrial complexes, helicopters flying beneath bridges, entire SWAT teams mobilizing, and explosions unfolding on a scale the original film could never approach. Then there are the images of futuristic warfare, tanks crushing skulls beneath red skies, showing just how much larger Cameron had made this world. Cameron isn't simply making a chase film anymore, he's constructing an apocalyptic blockbuster. And honestly, you can feel every dollar on screen. But at the time, this was one of the most expensive films ever produced, and unlike some large-scale productions where you constantly sense the money being spent, Tadwo transforms that scale into atmosphere. The movie feels enormous without feeling artificial. That's an incredibly difficult balance to achieve because larger budgets can absolutely damage sequels, especially sequels to films that work precisely because of their simplicity. A lot of franchises lose their identity the moment studios start writing larger checks. Suddenly everything becomes louder, shinier, more excessive, more a spectacle, less tension. But Cameron understood something essential here. Scale only works if the story still feels personal. That's why even though Waititi is massive compared to the original, it never completely loses a focus on Sarah, John, and the Terminator. The emotional core remains surprisingly intimate. At its heart, it's still about protecting one child, preventing only a future, holding on to one final opportunity to stop humanity from destroying itself. The difference is that now the film has room to breathe visually. The future war sequences are a perfect example of how dramatically the scale evolved. In the first film, those fragmented glimpses of the future were terrifying, partly because they were so brief. You saw flashes of skulls scattered across ruined ground, laser fire cutting through smoke, machines moving through destruction like predators in a dead world. Your imagination filled in the rest. Inatitwab. Cameron finally has the resources to fully visualize that future. And honestly, it looks horrifying. Not a glamorous science fiction warfare, not a stylized spectacle. It feels like the collapse of civilization itself. Everything carries more weight in the movie, too. The trucks feel heavier, the weapons feel more imposing, the action sequences unfold on an almost absurd scale. Yet they remain grounded because Cameron keeps everything tactile and physical. That's probably one of the biggest reasons the film has aged so well. A lot of modern blockbusters can feel strangely weightless because so much exists entirely inside digital environments. In Titwab, when a truck tears through concrete, it genuinely feels like several tons of steel just ripped through the earth. When the helicopter moves beneath the bridge during the chase sequence, part of your brain immediately wonders, did Thea actually do that? And the film just keeps escalating. That's another thing Cameron handles exceptionally well here. Every action sequence feels larger than the one before it without exhausting the audience. First, it's a tense hallway encounter, then a motorcycle pursuit, then massive trucks crashing through the city, then helicopters, then finally the steel mill confrontation turning into this towering industrial nightmare. The scale keeps increasing, but the movie somehow maintains momentum instead of collapsing under its own ambition. I also think the larger budget allowed Cameron to fully realize the mythology in ways the original simply couldn't. You get more detail surrounding Skynet, a Judgment Day, cybernetic systems, the future war, The evolution of Thea technology itself. The world suddenly feels larger than one desperate chase through Los Angeles. But importantly, Cameron never allows the mythology to overwhelm the film. You're not trapped but listening to endless explanations about the timelines and machine hierarchies for half the runtime. He gives the audience exactly enough information to expand the universe while still keeping the story moving forward. That's a huge reason why it will remains accessible even to viewers who aren't deeply invested in the science fiction lore. And visually, the movie carries this unmistakably blockbuster confidence. The opening alone immediately announces that the franchise has transformed. The flames, the metallic skulls, the machine is advancing across the battlefield beneath the red skies. It feels mythic now. The first film was a nightmare. T2O feels like that nightmare expanded across the entire planet. At the same time, though, I don't think Cameron ever abandoned the DNA of the original film. That's the crucial detail. Beneath the larger action and expanded environments, there's still this constant feeling of pursuit, of inevitability. The T-1000 never truly stops advancing. Even during quieter moments, the film carries attention underneath everything like a ticking clock. And honestly, that's what separates it from a lot of modern bigger sequel filmmaking. It expands the world without losing the fear. Because a lot of sequels assume larger automatically means better. More characters, more subplots, more CGI, more noise. But Terminator 2 understands that scale only matters if the audience still emotionally feels the threat beneath it all. That's why the movie never simply feels expensive, it feels epic. The setup for Terminator 2 is honestly one of those sequel concepts that sounds deceptively simple when described out loud, when Cameron's execution makes it instantly compelling. Technically, yes, the film is repeating the structure of the original. Somebody is sent back in time to eliminate Connor. Someone else is sent back to protect them. Chases unfold. Humanity's future hangs in the balance. On paper, that sounds dangerously close to simply recreating the first movie with a larger budget. When Cameron changes one major element and suddenly the entire emotional energy transforms. This time the Terminator is the protector. That's such a brilliant creative decision because the audience enters the film carrying memories of the original. We remember Arnold as this unstoppably mechanical nightmare, so when he appears again in T2O, the movie manipulates those expectations perfectly. The Terminators are searching for John Connor. One looks familiar, one doesn't, and for a brief period, especially if audiences experience the film without knowing the reveal beforehand, Cameron allows that uncertainty to linger. Then in the hallway sequence in the mall happens, and honestly, it's still one of the most effective reveals in a blockbuster cinema. The shotgun emerges from the flower box, Arnold steps forward, get down, and within seconds, the entire identity of the franchise shifts. Now, instead of fleeing from the Terminator, the characters are surviving alongside him. That single choice gives the movie an entirely different emotional structure from the original because the first film was fundamentally about survival. Sarah Connor trying desperately not to die. It will become more about protection, about preventing the future before it arrives. And the focus this time is John Connor himself. I actually think making John a child instead of introducing him immediately as some hardened military genius was a smart decision. He's just a rebellious teenager riding dirt bikes, hacking atoms, frustrating his foster parents, listening to loud music. He doesn't fully understand the weight of what has destined to become. Meanwhile, Sarah Connor already carries the full psychological burden of that future. That creates a really compelling tension inside the story because Sarah lives in a permanent fear while John still retains the fragments of a normal childhood. To the outside world, Sarah appears unstable, She's confined inside a psychiatric institution, warning people about Judgment Day, and machine assassins Willie doctors dismiss her as paranoid and delusional, but the audience knows she's telling the truth. That's what makes her situation genuinely tragic, and hanging over all of this is the time travel logic. Which honestly, if you analyze it too intensely, your brain eventually starts tying itself into knots. Even the film itself almost seems aware of that. Timeline loops, alternate futures, paradoxes, Skynet sending machines back after already losing. None of it entirely survives obsessive scrutiny if you start diagramming every detail on a whiteboard at 3 o'clock in the morning. But strangely, the movie gets away with it because Cameron treats time travel less like a puzzle to mathematically solve and more like a source of tension. The important question isn't whether every timeline detail fits together perfectly. The important question is whether the future can actually be changed. That's the emotional engine driving the story. And honestly, that's one of the reasons the film works so much better than many modern time travel blockbusters that disappear beneath their own complexity. Cameron keeps the focus remarkably clear. The audience always understands the stakes, even when the mechanics become messy. Stop Judgment Day, protected John Connor, survived the T-1000, simple. And speaking of the T-1000, making the new Terminator more advanced than Arnold's older model was another incredibly smart decision because it immediately creates a balance. The T-800 suddenly feels outdated, powerful, absolutely, but still older technology. Meanwhile, the T-1000 is faster, more adaptive, more intelligent. Almost ghost-like in the way it moves through the world. That creates constant pressure throughout the movie because even with the Terminator protecting them, the characters never truly feel safe. The film also handles the future war material very carefully. Instead of overwhelming the audience with endless exposition, Cameron gives brief but unforgettable glimpses: nuclear fire, machine armies, human skulls crushed beneath metal tracks, enough to constantly remind viewers what's waiting if the characters fail. Enthusiasm moments matter because they keep the stakes emotional instead of abstract. Judgment Day isn't simply some distant science fiction concept. Sarah has already seen it in her nightmares. She feels it approaching like an unavoidably certainty. That fear hangs over the entire film. At the same time though, HUO introduces something the original barely allowed itself to consider. Maybe the future isn't fixed. Maybe fate can actually be changed. That idea ultimately becomes the emotional heart of the entire story. Not the explosions, not the weapons, not even the Terminators themselves. It's really about whether humanity is destined to engineer its own destruction, or whether people still have the ability to choose a different path, which is kind of remarkable when you think about it. Because beneath all the motorcycle pursuits and machine gun fire, Terminator 2 is fundamentally a story about trying to stop the future before it arrives, and somehow the film makes those ideas feel thrilling instead of overly philosophical. One of the boldest decisions Titwo makes, and honestly only of the riskiest, is how completely it transforms the tone of the franchise without losing its identity in the process. Because if you watch the Terminator and immediately continue into Tito, the contrast becomes obvious almost instantly. The first film is essentially a nightmare, cold, minimal, intensely tense. The atmosphere feels exhausted and grimy. Most of the story unfolds at night. Everyone looks emotionally worn down, and Arnold's Terminator moves through the movie like an unavoidable force of death. There's very little humor, very little warmth. Even the romance carries this tragic desperation because the entire film feels consumed by inevitability. Then the Titwo begins and suddenly there's scale, attitude, humor, motorcycles, massive action sequences, kids saying no problemo, Guns N' Roses playing in the background. The franchise evolves into a blockbuster. And honestly, that transition shouldn't work as well as it does, because normally, when sequels try to lighten darker source material, they lose something essential. The raw edges disappear, the danger softens, characters become cleaner, safer, more commercially polished. But Cameron pulls off this incredibly delicate balancing act where Tito becomes more entertaining, and more emotional without abandoning the underlying fear that it defines the world. The biggest only evolution obviously comes through Arnold himself. In the original film, as a genuinely intimidating, almost unsettling at times, there's virtually no humanity in the performance. He speaks only when necessary, and every scene involving him carries tension because you instinctively know someone is about to be taken down. In Tito, though, Arnold becomes strangely lovable, which sounds absurd when you say it out loud because he's still a towering machine carrying shotguns through Los Angeles in black leather. But the film leans into his awkwardness in this surprisingly charming way. The humor works because it grows naturally out of the character trying to interpret a human behavior. The Terminator repeating a slang, misunderstanding emotional nuance, taking language completely literally. Cameron never allows it to drift into parody. That's important. The audience is allowed to laugh, but the machine never becomes incompetent or cartoonish. There's still presence behind him, still danger. And honestly, that tonal shift is probably one of the biggest reasons the movie connected with such an enormous audience. The first Terminator almost feels like cult science fiction horror. 2 feels universal. It has action, suspense, emotional depth, humor, spectacle. There's a little of everything in it. What's interesting though is that beneath the larger blockbuster energy, the film remains surprisingly dark when you really examine it. Sarah Connor is psychologically shattered. Judgment Day is still approaching. The future war imagery remains horrifying. There's literally a nuclear nightmare sequence where children are vaporized beside a playground. So even though Tito is undeniably more crowd-pleasing than the original, Cameron never fully saw fence of the core themes. The apocalypse still hangs over the entire story like a shadow the characters can't escape. I think that's part of why the emotional moments land so effectively, too. The first movie keeps the audience tense. Tito actually allows the audience to care. The relationship between John and the T-800 gives the film a warmth that the original intentionally avoided. Suddenly, there are quieter scenes, conversations, small moments of humor, characters learning from one another. The movie slows down just enough for emotional connection before throwing everyone back into chaos again. And honestly, attempting that tonal balance in a sequel like this is dangerous because it could have become sentimental very easily. Some people still feel certain moments lean too heavily into emotion compared to the brutal simplicity of the first film, and I understand that criticism. The original possessed this relentless purity. Tito absolutely wants the audience to leave emotionally fulfilled in a way the first movie never attempted, but honestly, to argue that tonal evolution is exactly why the sequel became iconic. Cameron understood he couldn't simply remake the original. If Arnold remained the antagonist and the sequel repeated the same horror thriller structure beat for beat, audiences probably would have enjoyed it. But I don't think the film would still dominate conversations decades later in the same way. Instead, Cameron expanded the emotional range of the franchise. The movie can move from attention to humor to genuine emotional resonance within the same sequence and somehow never feel only unstable. That's incredibly difficult to achieve. Most action films either become overwhelmingly self-serious or disappear into constant jokes. Tone exists somewhere between those extremes. Even visually, the tone evolves. The first movie feels claustrophobic and grimy. 2 feels wider, brighter, more cinematic. Not necessarily safer, just a larger, more mythic. The apocalypse story is no longer unfolding quietly in the dark corners. It's expanding into the open world now. And honestly, I think the tonal flexibility is one of the reasons the movie has aged so gracefully. It isn't trapped inside a single emotional register. You can revisit it for the action or the suspense or the emotional ending, or simply to watch Arnold operating at back movie star presence. The film constantly shifts energy without losing momentum. That's really the impressive achievement. Chivo evolves from horror into epic science fiction action without betraying what made the original meaningful in the first place. It still feels like the same universe, the same fear, the same looming inevitability, just viewed through a much broader emotional lens. The nightmare never disappeared. It simply learned how to entertain you while it was chasing you. What James Cameron accomplishes with Arnold Schwarzenegger in Terminator 2 is honestly one of the smartest character pivots in blockbuster history. Because you think about where Arnold existed before this film. In the original Terminator, he's essentially cinematic death, no empathy, no emotional warmth, just this unstoppable machine advancing forward while everyone around him collapses into a panic. At times, he barely even feels like a traditional character, more like a force of nature wearing sunglasses. And audiences love that version of him. So naturally, the safest creative choice for the sequel would have been simple: more of that. Larger body counts, bigger action, turn Arnold into an even more intimidating monster. Instead, Cameron completely reverses the dynamic. Now the Terminator is protecting people. That's such a risky decision, because the moment you transform the machine into the hero, you risk losing the very thing that made him intimidating in the first place. But somehow Titwa makes it work, because the film never pretends that T-800 suddenly became human. He's still emotionally disconnected, still awkward, still intensely literal. The difference is that now we're experiencing those qualities from the inside rather than the outside, and strangely enough, that makes him deeply likable. What's brilliant is how gradually Cameron shifts audience perception without fundamentally changing who the Terminator actually is. The machine still speaks the same way, still moves with a rigid precision, still approaches situations through pure logic, but now those qualities generate humor instead of fear. The deadpan delivery becomes entertaining. The stiffness becomes oddly charming. Arnold walking through human society while clearly not fully understanding humanity gives the film so much personality. And honestly, nobody else could have played this role the way Schwarzenegger did. That probably sounds obvious now because the performance became iconic. But there's a real reason for that. Arnold's limitations as an actor somehow became his strengths within the character. The accent, the rigid delivery, the slightly unnatural cadence in certain linear readings. All of it fits perfectly because he's literally portraying a machine attempting to imitate human behavior. It's one of those rare casting choices that feels almost inevitable in retrospect. Like the actor and the role were somehow designed for each other long before the cameras even started rolling, and by the time Tito arrives, the film fully understands Arnold Schwarzenegger's screen presence. The biker bar entrance alone communicates everything. Cameron frames him like a mythology brought to life. The boots, the leather jacket, the sunglasses, the shotgun spin, none of it is subtle. But subtlety isn't really the point. By the early 1990s, Arnold had evolved into something larger than a traditional movie star. He had become an icon. Shaw embraces that completely, but underneath all the style and spectacle, there's an actual character progression happening. And honestly, I think that's the part that people sometimes overlook. The Terminator's evolution isn't emotional in the conventional sense. He doesn't suddenly develop feelings like a sentimental science fiction cliché. Instead, he learns through observation. John teaches him language, reactions, boundaries, behavior. The Machinea gradually begins understanding humanity piece by piece without ever fully becoming human itself. That's why moments like, "Why do you cry?" actually land emotionally, because the movie earns them slowly. At the beginning, the T-800 is simply executing instructions: protect John Connor, complete the mission, nothing more. But gradually, the dynamic begins to shift. John stops viewing him purely as a protection and starts seeing him as something much closer to the father figure he never truly had. And honestly, that relationship becomes the emotional foundation of the entire film. The Terminator turns into this strange combination of bodyguard, mentor, older brother, and parent. He's the only presence in Jay's life that feels completely dependable, completely present. He won't abandon him, won't betray him, won't disappear. And when you really think about that, it's kind of heartbreaking. Especially because the machine itself can't fully comprehend why that bond matters so deeply to John. There's also a fascinating contrast between Arnold's role across the two films. In the original movie, he represented inevitability, pure unstoppable destruction. In Titwo, he becomes resistance against inevitability, the force standing between humanity and extinction. Sammy face completely different emotional meaning. And Schwarzenegger handles that balance remarkably well. He never pushes the comedy too far, never allows the character to collapse into self-parody. Even the famous one-liners work because he delivers them with absolute seriousness. That deadpan confidence became a massive part of why the performance embedded itself into pop culture permanently. I'll be back. Hasta la vista, baby. On paper, those lines could sound absurd coming from almost anyone else. Arnold somehow turns theme into mythology. At the same time, though, the film never completely removes the danger from him either. There are still moments reminding you that this machine was created for violence. Sarah Connor especially never fully trusts him at first. And honestly, why would she? She's staring at the Sammy face that destroyed her life years earlier. That lingering discomfort gives us the transformation additional depth. The Terminator becoming heroic doesn't erase what he once represented. The movie continually reminds the audience that beneath the protective programming is still a machine engineered to eliminate targets. John teaching him not to take lives becomes important because morality literally has to be taught to him. And by the end of the film, the T-800's final decision becomes surprisingly emotional, not because he suddenly became human, but because he evolved just enough to understand his sacrifice. That's what makes the ending resonate. You realize somewhere along the way, this giant mechanical figure who originally entered cinema as one of Fat's great nightmares quietly became the emotional center of the story, with how did the audience fully noticing the transition happening, which honestly shouldn't work. But Titwo handles it so naturally that now it's impossible to imagine the franchise evolving any other way. Arnold didn't simply return for the sequel. He transformed one of cinema's great monsters into one of its great heroes. One of the reasons Terminator 2 lands emotionally harder than people sometimes expect is because beneath all of the explosions and machine gun fire, it's secretly a story about a lonely child discovering the closest thing has ever had to a father figure, which sounds completely absurd when you remember that the father figure in question is a 7-foot Austrian machine from the future capable of punching through steel doors. But somehow it works, and not in a forced Hollywood way either. The relationship between John Connor and the T-800 develops so naturally over the course of the film that eventually you stop questioning how strange the premise actually is. When we first meet John, He's basically living inside instability. Foster homes, no real structure. A mother institutionalized while warning every India that the apocalypse is coming. As intelligent, rebellious, sarcastic, defensive, and honestly, you can tell he's trying very hard to appear tougher than he actually feels. That's one of the things I've always appreciated about Edward Furlong's performance. Now, admittedly, audiences have always been divided on him. Some viewers find him loud, irritating, aggressively representative of early 90s teenager energy, and yes, occasionally, he absolutely sounds like a kid who discovered slang about 10 minutes earlier. But strangely, that awkwardness makes the character feel authentic to me because John Connor at this stage isn't the legendary resistance leader yet. He's just a child, a confused child raised on paranoia, survival training, and stories about the end of the world before he was even old enough to fully understand what any of it meant. Sarah trained him to prepare for humanity's collapse while he was still growing up, so there's this constant tension inside him, part normal teenager, part future military commander, and then the Terminator arrives. At first, John almost treats the T-800 like the incredible weapon he suddenly controls. There's excitement in those early scenes when he realizes he can literally give orders to a Terminator, but gradually the relationship deepens into something more meaningful. The machine listens to him, protects him, remains beside him. That last part matters most because when you really examine Jay's life, nearly every adult around him has failed him in some way. Foster parents don't understand him. Authority figures dismiss him. His mother loves him deeply, but her trauma has made their relationship emotionally overwhelming and unstable. Sarah is preparing him to save humanity, but she isn't giving him anything remotely close to a normal childhood. Then this machine arrives and ironically becomes the most stable presence in his life, and the movie is intelligent enough not to oversell on you but emotionally. That restraint is exactly why it works. Cameron doesn't pause the narrative every few scenes to announce, "Look, they're bonding now." The relationship develops gradually through small moments. John teaching the Terminator slang, the awkward high-five attempts, explaining why humans cry, teaching him not to eliminate people. Those scenes matter because they slowly transform the T-800 from a weapon into an emotional anchor for John. What's fascinating is that the relationship changes both of them. John becomes more irresponsible because he slowly realizes the stakes are real. Meanwhile, the Terminator begins adapting to human behavior in ways that extend beyond pure mission programming. Not emotionally in a traditional sense, but behaviorally. He learns through observation, through John. And honestly, some of the film's funniest moments emerge directly from the dynamic. The T-800 trying to function socially is hilarious precisely because he's so terrible at it. Arnold plays those scenes with complete sincerity, which makes them even better. The machine repeating phrases like he is someone learning humanity from scratch becomes both funny and strangely touching at the same time. But the movie never allows you to forget the sadness underneath it all because John is ultimately bonding with something that technically isn't alive. There's a quiet tragedy running beneath their relationship where the Terminator can protect John physically, but he can never fully become what John emotionally needs him to be. He can imitate care, learn a behavior, understand purpose. And there's always a barrier separating imitation from genuine humanity, and somehow that limitation makes the connection feel even more emotional. The scene that always stays with me and even one of the massive action set pieces. It's the moment John realizes the Terminator would never abandon him, never disappear, never fail him in the ways real people often do. He says the machine would make a better father than most actual men. That line lands incredibly hard because suddenly you understand just how damaged this kid's world really is. The movie also smartly contrasts John's relationship with the Terminator against Sarah's relationship with it. Sarah sees the machine as a reminder of terror. John sees it as a safety. She fears it instinctively. He trusts it completely. That divide creates some of the strongest emotional tension in the middle portion of the film. And by the end, honestly, the finale works almost entirely because of that father-son dynamic. If the movie hadn't spent so much time carefully building their relationship, the final sacrifice wouldn't carry nearly the same emotional impact. But because the audience watched John gradually connect with this machine throughout the story, the goodbye suddenly becomes devastating in a way you don't necessarily expect from a science fiction action blockbuster, especially because the Terminator himself still doesn't fully understand human emotion. He isn't crying. He isn't becoming sentimental, but he understands enough now to recognize why his existence is dangerous and why John is hurting. That's the brilliance of it. The film never turns the T-800 into a human being. It simply allows him to become deeply important to one. Honestly, I think one of the biggest reasons Terminator 2 still feels emotionally powerful today is Sarah Connor. Not the action scenes, not the visual effects. Not even Arnold, as iconic as he is, Sarah Connor. Because when you really examine the film, she's the emotional center holding everything together. And what Linda Hamilton accomplishes with a character is genuinely remarkable when compared to where Sarah began in the original movie. In The Terminator, Sarah is essentially ordinary. That's what made her relatable. She's a waitress suddenly thrown into an impossibly nightmare. The movie forces her to evolve in real time just to survive. Titwa returns years later and asks a much more uncomfortable question. What would surviving something like that actually do to a person? And the answer the film gives is complicated. It damages her. That's what I love about Sarah Connor in this sequel. Cameron doesn't transform her into some polished action hero fantasy. He turns her into someone shaped by drama, hardened by it, consumed by it. She's paranoid, emotionally isolated, exhausted, constantly alert. She spent years preparing for an apocalypse nobody believes is coming while the entire world treats her as unstable. And from a society's perspective, she probably does appear unstable. That's the tragedy of the character. The audience knows she's right, but everyone around her sees women obsessively talking about machines, nuclear annihilation, Judgment Day, and the collapse of civilization itself. So, she's institutionalized, medicated, dismissed, restrained. There's something deeply frustrating about watching that because we understand she's carrying the weight of humanity's future almost entirely alone. Linda Hamilton plays all of it with this intensity that still feels unmatched in a lot of action cinema. She never enters the scenes trying to appear effortlessly cool. Sarah Connor in Tito looks exhausted, wounded, hypervigilant. Even when she's standing still, there's a tension in her body like she's expecting a catastrophe at any moment. And physically, the transformation is startling the first time you see it. The vulnerable waitress from the original film is gone. Now she's muscular, scarred, disciplined, almost military in the way she moves. You can tell this is someone who has spent years preparing for war before the war even began. What makes Hamilton's performance exceptional is that she never allows Sarah to become emotionally hollow. Beneath all the toughness, there's still a fear, still grief, still guilt, especially when it comes to John. That relationship is incredibly complicated in Titwa, and I'm glad the movie never simplifies it. Sarah loves her son completely. But her fear of the future has consumed her life so thoroughly that as she struggles to simply be his mother, she's raising him to survive the apocalypse. not to experience childhood. And you can feel the emotional damage that created. John respects her, but has a frightened by her sometimes, too. There's emotional distance between them. Exhaustion. Sarah is so focused on not preparing him to become humanity's future leader that she unintentionally denies him the opportunity to simply be a kid. And honestly, the film is fully aware of that tragedy. That's why her scenes resonate more deeply than a typical strong female action hero performance. Sarah isn't strong because the script declares her strong. She's strong because survival forced her into becoming that person. There's a huge difference. I also think people forget how groundbreaking this character felt at the time. Modern Hollywood constantly talks about powerful female protagonists, but Sarah Connor in Chitwoa still feels more authentic than many modern examples because the movie actually understands the psychological cost attached to that strength. Her resilience is inseparable from her drama. There's this incredibly contradiction within the character where she's probably the toughest person in the entire movie and also one of the saddest. The nightmare sequence alone communicates everything happening inside her mentally. Watching the playground erupt in nuclear fire while children are consumed in front of her as she screams helplessly behind the fence, that scene isn't simply spectacle. It's Sarah living with apocalypse inside her mind every single day. That fear drives everything she does. And then there's the Dryson sequence. Honestly, one of the strongest scenes in the film because that's the moment Sarah almost crosses a line she can't emotionally return from. She becomes so consumed by preventing a judgment day that she's willing to eliminate man in front of his family if it means stopping the future from happening. And the movie doesn't frame it as some triumphant action moment either. It's disturbing, painful. You can watch her emotionally unravel while trying to convince herself it's necessary. That's what makes Sarah such a fascinating character. She's trying to save humanity while gradually losing parts of her own humanity in the process. At the same time though, the movie quietly positions her as the true hero of the franchise. Not because she's physically unstoppable, but because she refuses to surrender to inevitability. Everyone else either ignores the future or accepts it. Sarah fights against Haida constantly, even when it destroys her personal life along the way. And honestly, without Linda Hamilton fully committing to the emotional reality of that drama, Chitwoa probably doesn't work nearly as well as it does, because beneath all the spectacle, Sarah Connor grounds the story emotionally. She reminds the audience that Judgment Day isn't just an interesting science fiction concept. It represents the potential loss of billions of lives, families, children, entire cities erased in moments. She carries that knowledge at every second of the movie. And by the end, what truly makes Sarah Connor iconic isn't simply that she's tough. It's that she's terrified and keeps moving forward. Anyway, the smartest thing Terminator 2 does with its antagonist is realizing there's absolutely no point trying to out Arnold Schwarzenegger. You can simply introduce another massive machine and expect it to feel more intimidating than in the original Terminator. The first movie already perfected that approach. So, instead of going physically larger, Cameron moves in the complete opposite direction, and that's exactly why T-1000 works so brilliantly. Robert Patrick's Terminator feels terrifying because he feels evolved, cleaner, faster, colder, less like a machine engineered for war, and more like something specifically designed for pursuit. Arnold's T-800 in the original film was essentially a walking tank. Heavy footsteps, mechanical force, pure brute strength, crashing through walls and tearing through obstacles. The T-1000 barely appears to exert effort at all. He moves with a sheer fluidity that feels unnatural even before the liquid metal abilities fully reveal themselves. There's something deeply unsettling about how calm he is. That's always the detail that stays with me revisiting the film. Robert Patrick never overplays the role. No dramatic monologues, no theatrical villainous speeches. Half the time he's simply staring at people with this blank expression, like he's already calculated exactly how their lives end. And honestly, disguising him as a police officer is a brilliant creative decision. Cameron takes this futuristic nightmare machine and wraps it in the image of everyday authority. A police officer is supposed to symbolize safety, a structure, reassurance. The T-1008 twists that familiarity into something predatory. Every time he calmly walks into a room asking questions, there's a tension beneath the scene because the audience understands what he truly is. And Robert Patrick sells that perfectly. There's this incredible physical precision to his performance throughout the entire movie, especially the way he runs. It doesn't even look fully human, and no wasted motion, no visible exhaustion, a just relentless forward momentum. Apparently, Patrick trained himself to breathe only through his nose during running scenes, so he would appear more machine-like on screen. And honestly, it absolutely worked. The man moves like he is software, occupying a human body. Then you layer the liquid metal abilities and on top of that, and suddenly the protagonists are dealing with something that barely obeys normal physical rules anymore. That's what makes the T-1000 feel so intimidating compared to many blockbuster antagonists. You genuinely don't know how the hero's area is supposed to stop him. Bullets barely matter. Explosions barely matter. He gets frozen, shattered into fragments. Then calmly reforms as if reality itself only mildly inconvenienced him. And the remarkable thing is that the visual effects still hold up largely because the underlying concept is so elegant. Liquid metal shape-shifting, mimicking a people. Cameron doesn't drown the audience in endless scientific jargon or overcomplicated explanations. He presents the idea visually and trusts the viewers to immediately understand why it's terrifying. There's also this almost ghost-like quality to the T-1000. Arnold's Terminator feels mechanical and physical. You can imagine gears, pistons, hydraulics underneath the skin. The T-1000 almost feels supernatural at times, passing through bars, reforming through prison gates, changing shape effortlessly. In certain moments, he feels less like a robot and more like a nightmare adapting itself in real time. That contrast between the two Terminators is what creates so much of the film's tension. The T-800 suddenly feels outdated, still powerful. Absolutely, but older technology, slower, less advanced, and the movie constantly reinforces that imbalance. The T-1000 recovers faster, moves faster, adapts faster. It represents evolution overtaking older machinery. And interestingly, because Arnold's Terminator becomes more humanized in a titwo, the T-1000 inherits much of the cold terror associated with the original film. He becomes the nightmare. Now, there's one moment in particular that always stays with me. When Sarah Connor escapes the hospital, turns the corner expecting freedom, and suddenly sees Arnold standing there. For a split second, she believes the horror from the first movie has returned. Then, the T-1000 appears behind her, and both Sarah and the audience realize that there's something even worse pursuing them now. That scene perfectly defined as the villain dynamic in Titwo. I also love how restrained the T-1000 remains throughout the film. A lot of blockbuster villains eventually become overly talkative or theatrical. The T-1000 barely needs dialogue because the threat already speaks for itself. Robert Patrick plays him with this chilling control where even small gestures feel dangerous, and when he imitates politeness or emotion, it somehow becomes even more unsettling. The cop voices, the artificial friendliness, The faint smiles that never quite feel natural. It's like you're watching something study human behavior academically without ever truly understanding humanity itself. At the same time, Cameron also uses the T-1000 to deepen the movie's larger themes. The T-800 is gradually a learning about humanity, while the T-1000 remains completely detached from it. One machine slowly develops understanding. The other remains pure function, pure mission. Eliminate John Connor. Nothing else matters. And honestly, part of why the T-1000 became such an iconic antagonist is because the movie never weakens him simply to make the heroes appear stronger. He dominates most encounters. Huge portions of the film are built around the protagonists desperately trying to survive him. Even when the T-800 fights back, it often feels less like victory and more like a temporary resistance. That imbalance keeps the tension alive all the way through the story because deep down the audience keeps asking the same question. How do you even stop this thing? By the time the steel mill climax arrives, the T-1000 has essentially transformed Ida into this melting unstable embodiment of unstoppable technological horror. And even then, the movie extracts every final ounce of fear from him before the conclusion, which is why Robert Patrick's performance still stands as one of the great science fiction villains, not because he's loud, nor because he's flashy, because he feels inevitable. One thing I think Terminator 2 deserves far more credit for is how effectively it handles the ordinary people surrounding all the chaos. Because it would have been very easy for the movie to become nothing but Arnold vs. Liquid Metal Robot for 2 hours. And honestly, with action seen as it is strong, audiences probably still would have enjoyed themselves immensely. When Cameron constantly grounds the story through ordinary human beings who make the apocalypse feel emotionally real, that matters. A lot of large-scale science fiction films talk endlessly about saving humanity, but you rarely feel actual humanity inside them. Characters announce that the world is in danger while explosions happen in the background. 2 works differently because it continually shows how these massive future stakes affect real people. The best example of that is Miles Dyson. Honestly, Joe Morton is kind of the secret weapon of the movie's second half, because when Sarah first talks about Dyson, the film frames him almost like a villain before we ever meet him. This brilliant engineer unknowingly creating the technology that will eventually destroy civilization. In Sarah's mind, he's essentially responsible for billions of future deaths. Then the movie introduces him and he's just a person, a husband, a father, a normal man working on technology he doesn't fully understand yet. That's what makes the Zabardast sequences so emotionally effective. Dyson isn't malicious. He isn't some power-obsessed scientist trying to bring about humanity's downfall. He's actually a warm, intelligent, likable. You watch him joking with his family, living an ordinary life, completely unaware that his research eventually contributes to a judgment day. And suddenly the movie becomes morally more complicated because Sarah Connor has spent years imagining this almost mythological enemy in her mind. But when she finally confronts him, reality collides with her fear. She's staring at an innocent man with a family, not a monster. That scene where she nearly takes his life is one of the most uncomfortable moments in the film for exactly that reason. You can feel how deeply drama has distorted her thinking. She's trying to save the future, but she's also terrifying a wife and child in the process. And Joe Morton handles Dyson's realization beautifully. He doesn't suddenly transform into an action hero. He reacts like an actual human being trying to process impossible information all at once. That human reaction matters because it reminds you that Terminator 2 isn't really about machines conquering the world. It's about human beings accidentally creating something beyond their ability to control. Even the smaller supporting characters reinforce that feeling. Thea foster parents aren't deeply explored or anything, but they help establish that John's life was already unstable long before the Terminators returned. Thea hospital staff surrounding Sarah Connor add another layer, too. Because from their perspective, she genuinely appears dangerous and delusional. They have no idea they're trapped inside the middle of a science fiction apocalypse narrative. And honestly, that's one of Cameron's greatest strengths as a filmmaker in general. He gives idea characters just enough personality and humanity that the world feels inhabited by actual people instead of disposably background figures waiting for explosions. Even tiny moments linger in your memory. The nervous security guard, the scientists panicking during the Zabardast assault, the terrified reactions during the drug pursuit. The movie constantly reminds you that ordinary people are caught in the middle of this future war chaos, whether they understand it or not, and that's part of what gives the stakes genuine emotional weight, because Judgment Day is never treated like some abstract cool sci-fi concept. The film continually brings either back to families, children, civilians, everyday routines. The nuclear nightmare sequence works because Cameron focuses on playgrounds, parents, and ordinary life being erased instantly. The apocalypse feels personal. That's also why Dyson's sacrifice lands emotionally. By the time he chooses to help destroy his own work, the audience fully understands what's at stake through him. He becomes this symbol of humanity, attempting to correct its own mistake before it's too late. And honestly, I think it will become a much smarter film because of characters like him. Without those human elements, the movie probably still succeeds as a spectacular action experience. But with them, the story gains moral tension, consequence. Suddenly, the future war isn't simply about machines and destruction anymore. It becomes about responsibility. Who creates dangerous technology? Who controls it? Who suffers when things spiral beyond control? The movie never overexplains those ideas, but they're sitting quietly beneath the surface the entire time. And honestly, I think that's part of why the emotional stakes still resonate decades later, because beneath all the chrome, fire, and gunfire, Terminator 2 constantly reminds you what the characters are actually fighting for. Not victory, not glory, just the chance for ordinary people to continue living ordinary lives. It's honestly difficult to fully explain to modern audiences just how overwhelming the effects in Terminator 2 felt back in 1991, because now we live in an era where viewers see massive digital cities collapsing every other weekend. Superheroes fly through dimensional portals, entire planets explode, actors are digitally digged by computers. Gia exists everywhere now, sometimes to the point where audiences barely consciously register it anymore. But it arrived during this strange moment where digital effects still felt almost magical, actual magic, and James Cameron understood exactly how to use that feeling. The T-1000 wasn't simply another creature with impressive makeup or animatronics attached to it. The thing transformed, melted, walked through metal bars, reassembled itself after being shattered apart, became other people. Audiences in 1991 genuinely had never seen anything like it before. The liquid metal effects hit people like a shockwave. Even now, revisiting the movie decades later, some of those sequences still carry this uncanny quality. The famous checkered floor shot, the silver metal reforming itself, the blade arms emerging without a warning. There's a simplicity to the visual concept that gives it this timeless power. And honestly, I think a part of why the effects have aged so gracefully is because Cameron never relied on CGI alone. That's something people sometimes forget. Too into drowning in digital effects from beginning to end. The film uses themes strategically. Cameron combines CGI with practical effects, miniatures, prosthetics, stunt work, puppetry. All of this traditional filmmaking and craftsmanship working together alongside a brand new technology. That combination is what gives the movie weight. Stanley Winston's practical effects work especially deserves far more recognition than it usually gets. Their area sequences audiences assume are entirely computer-generated that were actually achieved using physical models and incredibly detailed practical setups. The T-1000 splitting apart, damaged faces reforming, metallic wounds opening across the body. So much of that involved practical artistry layered carefully together with digital enhancement. And because real physical objects existed on set, the effects feel connected to the environment around them. That's why the movie still holds up. While some CGI-heavy films from the same era feel noticeably dated now. Of course, you can criticize parts of it. The time travel mechanics become messy if you overanalyze them. Some dialogue has not aged perfectly. Certain viewers still prefer the raw horror atmosphere of the original. Edward Furlong's performance remains divisive, and yes, Cameron occasionally indulges in spectacle a little too much because he is clearly having an incredible time blowing things up. But those flaws feel relatively minor compared with what the movie accomplishes overall. Because when T2 is working, and most of the time, it feels almost untouchable. The drainage canal chase still delivers. The T-1000 remains terrifying. Sarah Connor remains iconic. Arnold still dominates the screen. The visual effects continue to hold up remarkably well. And somehow, against all odds, the emotional ending still hits just as hard. That is the part that stays with me. A lot of movies eventually become nostalgia pieces, where audiences mainly remember how exciting they once felt. T2 certainly carries nostalgia now, but it survives beyond nostalgia because the craftsmanship underneath it remains genuinely strong. The filmmaking still works. The atmosphere still works. The emotional core still works. And honestly, one of the most impressive things about Terminator 2 is that it never feels cynical, even at its loudest and most crowd-pleasing. There is a genuine sincerity running through the entire movie. Cameron clearly cares about these characters. He cares about the themes. He cares about humanity's relationship with technology, the idea of fate, and the possibility that people can still choose a better future. That sincerity gives the spectacle emotional weight. Without it, the movie might have become just another entertaining 1990s blockbuster with impressive effects. Instead, it became one of the defining action films ever made. Maybe that is why audiences are still debating whether it is better than the original after all these years. Usually, when people passionately argue about two movies for decades, it means both films matter deeply, just in completely different ways. The first Terminator is leaner, scarier, and more intimate. T2 is larger, more emotional, and more mythic. Personally, I don't think choosing between them is really the point anymore. Together, they complement each other almost perfectly. One creates the nightmare. The other expands that nightmare into something tragic, hopeful, and strangely human. Very few sequels in movie history have managed to evolve their franchise so successfully without losing what made the original special. That alone makes Terminator 2 remarkable. But beyond all the analysis, the themes, the visual effects discussions, and the filmmaking conversations, the simplest truth is this: the movie is still unbelievably entertaining. More than 30 years later, audiences can still sit down, hear that iconic metallic theme begin, watch Arnold step onto the screen wearing sunglasses and leather, and immediately become immersed in the experience all over again. That kind of staying power cannot really be manufactured. A movie either leaves a permanent mark on cinema, or it doesn't. Terminator 2 absolutely did. Cameron wasn't trying to replace reality with computers. He was using computers to extend reality. That's a huge difference. Industrial Light and Magic completely changed the game here, too. The work they accomplished in Titwal helped redefine what Hollywood believed it was technologically possible. You can draw a direct line from the T-1000 to the explosion of digital filmmaking throughout the rest of the decade. Honestly, the movie opened the floodgates. After Titwal, studios realized computers could create imagery audiences had literally never seen before. You start watching CGI evolve rapidly throughout the 1990s because this film proved the technology could genuinely support mainstream blockbuster storytelling instead of existing purely as a novelty. But what I really appreciate revisiting Tito now is how disciplined Cameron remains with the effects. He doesn't constantly show off. The T-1000's abilities appear when they serve tension, surprise, or horror. Cameron understands restraint. Sometimes the most impressive part of an effect isn't the effect itself. It's the build-up before it happens. Take the hospital floor sequence. The movie doesn't immediately announce itself with a look what CGI can do. Instead, it quietly allows the T-1000 to emerge through the bars, and your brain takes a second to fully process what you're seeing. That slight delay makes the moment even more unsettling. And weirdly, some modern CGI-heavy blockbusters actually feel less believable than two because they overwhelm the audience non-stop. Cameron gives the effects room to breathe. The practical action sequences help enormously, too. The truck pursuits, the explosions, the helicopter stunts, the motorcycle sequences. So much of the film exists physically in the real world that when the digital moments arrive, they feel grounded inside tangibly environments. Your brain accepts the impossible more easily because everything surrounding it already feels real. There's also something incredibly elegant about the design philosophy behind the T-1000 itself. The effects are visually complex but conceptually simple. Liquid metal, that's it. You immediately understand the danger without requiring endless exposition. Cameron doesn't bury the audience beneath technical explanations about futuristic molecular systems or nanotechnology jargon. He trusts visual storytelling completely. And honestly, some of the effects still look better than modern blockbusters operating with exponentially more computing power. Partly because Cameron was obsessive about lighting and physical integration. The reflections, shadows, and movement of the T-1000 actually interact correctly with the environment around him. Even today, that attention to detail matters far more than raw graphical complexity. And the movie always understands when to make the effects disturbing instead of merely impressive. The fingers becoming blades. The copied identities. The way the T-1000 reforms after damage. As if pain means absolutely nothing to it. Those moments still work because they're tied directly to suspense and fear rather than spectacle alone. That's the real genius behind T2's visual effects work. It isn't technology existing purely for the sake of technology. Every visual breakthrough strengthens the story, the tension, or the atmosphere. The effects never exist separately from the movie itself. They are part of the movie's emotional language. The T-1000 literally could not function as a villain without them. And honestly, that's why Terminator 2 still feels revolutionary even now. Not because it was simply an early CGI film, because it was one of the first major blockbusters to fully understand how digital effects could emotionally affect an audience instead of merely impressing them technically. The technology changed cinema, but the filmmaking is what made it timeless. One thing that really stands out revisiting Terminator 2 today is how visually specific the film feels, and I mean that in the best possibly way. A lot of modern blockbusters eventually blur together aesthetically, similar color grading, similar digital polish, similar flat lighting where everything looks technically expensive but somehow strangely forgettable at the same time. 2 doesn't have that problem at all. You can freeze almost any frame from this movie and recognize it instantly. the cold blue lighting, the steel textures, the glowing red Futuria war imagery, the industrial shadows. James Cameron and cinematographer Adam Greenberg gave this film such a distinctive visual identity that it almost feels carved out of metal itself. The atmosphere begins working immediately during the opening future war sequences. Those images are permanently burned into people's memories for a reason. Human skulls crushed beneath machine tracks, laser fire cutting through smoke, massive hunter-killers drifting through a darkness. It feels less like polished futuristic science fiction and more like a civilization collapsing into machinery. And the cinematography matters enormously there. Everything looks cold, harsh, mechanical. Even the fire summit feels metallic in this movie. Then the story shifts into present-day Los Angeles, but the atmosphere never fully relaxes. Cameron keeps tension hanging over everything visually. Night scene is aglow with deep blue tones. Reflections bounce across chrome surfaces. Headlights cut through darkness, like searchlights scanning for targets. The movie constantly feels suspended between the real world and the nightmare future, waiting beneath it. Honestly, Cameron's obsession with blue lighting is everywhere throughout it, and some it works perfectly. Normally, describing a film as blue sounds almost lifeless, but here those cold tones create mood constantly. Hospitals feel sterile and claustrophobic. Industrial environments feel almost post-apocalyptic. Even the quieter scenes carry this chilly atmosphere, reminding you the future war is always looming somewhere in the background. And then whenever Cameron wants contrast, he introduces fire. The nuclear nightmare sequence is probably the strongest visual example of that entire approach. The playground scene remains horrifying because it initially looks so ordinary. Bright daylight, children playing, calm suburban routine, then suddenly the blast wave arrives and the frame transforms into this inferno of heat and destruction. That image of Sarah Connor gripping the fence while the flames consume everything around her. Honestly, that's the kind of cinematic imagery that stays with people for decades. It isn't simply spectacle. It feels like drama burned directly into the film itself. I also love how physical the environments feel throughout the movie. The biker bar, the shopping mall corridors, the drainage canal, Zabardast, the steel mill. Every location has texture, real texture. You can practically feel the concrete, steel, sweat, grease, and heat. The world never feels digitally assembled, it feels lived in. That's a huge reason the action sequences still hold up so well, too. The cinematography gives the movie weight. Cameron never shoots action like random chaos stitched together in editing. There's always a spatial clarity. You understand where characters are positioned, where danger is approaching from, how close everything feels. The camera moves with a purpose instead of shaking wildly to imitate intensity. And honestly, some of the compositions in this movie are simply iconic. Arnold stepping out during the elevator sequence. The T-1000 emerging from flames. Sarah on the asylum hallway. The slow-motion reveal at the mall. The silhouettes during the steel mill climax. The film constantly creates imagery that feels mythic without becoming overly stylized. That balance is incredibly difficult to achieve because it absolutely feels cinematic and heightened, but it never drifts into cartoon territory. Even with liquid metal machines and time travel, the world itself remains grounded enough for the danger to feel emotionally real. There's also something very smart about it, the way Cameron visually separates the two Terminators. The T-800 feels heavy and industrial. Leather jackets, motorcycles, shotguns, steel machinery, everything surrounding Arnold carries this brute force physicality. The T-1000, meanwhile, feels sleek and reflective. Cleaner lines, police uniforms, smooth surfaces, Even the lighting around him often feels colder and more sterile. Cameron subtly reinforces the idea that this machina represents a newer, more advanced evolution. And the future where glimpses almost feel like fragments from an entirely different movie in terms of atmosphere. Those scenes are terrifying precisely because they remain brief. Cameron never settles into them long enough for the audience to become uncomfortable. You see flashes, metal skeletons moving through smoke, humans hiding underground, machines dominating the sky, and your imagination fills in the rest. That restraint makes the future feel larger. I honestly think that's one of the reasons the movie aged so gracefully. Overall, Cameron wasn't chasing temporary visual trends. He was constructing a mood, a visual language. Everything in the film, the lighting, production design, framing, color palette, feeds into this larger idea of humanity trapped between cold machinery and extinction. Even the steel mill finale feels symbolic visually, fiery against metal, heat against machinery, a human emotion colliding with something mechanical and inhuman. And honestly, there's a reason so many action movies afterward tried imitating the Tita aesthetic, the metallic blues, industrial locations, slow-motion hero imagery, machine versus humana iconography. You can see echoes of these film all across 1990s science fiction action cinema afterward, but very few captured the same atmosphere because they copied the surface without understanding the emotion underneath it. 2 doesn't simply look cool, it feels so haunted. If there's one thing Terminator 2 absolutely refuses to do, it slows the momentum. This movie moves, and I don't just mean there are explosions happening constantly. Plenty of action films have explosions. 2 has propulsion. Every sequence feels like it's driving the story forward while simultaneously trying to surpass whatever came before it. What's remarkable is how early the movie starts operating at full intensity. 2. The mall sequence alone would probably serve as the climax of a lesser film. Cameron stages that entire scene with incredible escalation, gradually building tension before the audience fully understands exactly what's about to happen. You've got John Connor casually wandering through the mall, the T-1000 quietly closing in, Arnold arriving like some leather-jacketed force of nature. Then suddenly, shotguns erupt, motorcycles crash through glass, crowds panic. And honestly, the movie barely slows down after that point, and that hallway reveal still works perfectly. Arnold stepping forward with a shotgun and telling John to get down is one of those pure movie star moments where you can practically imagine theaters erupting back in 1991. Cameron understood exactly how to stage spectacle for maximum impact, but the thing that really separates it from a lot of action cinema is that the sequences feel physical. That's the word I keep returning to, physical. The drainage canal pursuit is probably the best example. A dirt bike racing through those enormous concrete flood channels while a massive truck tears after it genuinely feels dangerous. The truck itself almost becomes a monster during that sequence. It's loud, heavy, unstable, tearing through everything in its path while the T-1000 calmly continues advancing without urgency or panic, and then Arnold arrives on the motorcycle. Honestly, that entire pursuit sequence is blockbuster filmmaking operating at full capacity. The jumps, the shotgun reload spin, the pacing, the way Cameron constantly changes camera angles without sacrificing spatial clarity. It's chaos but carefully controlled chaos. You always understand where everyone is positioned. That's something modern action cinema strangely struggles with sometimes. So many contemporary blockbusters cut every half second until entire sequences become visual noise. Cameron directs action with clarity. He wants the audience to actually see what's happening, and because of that, the danger feels more immediate. Thea hospital escape sequence is an author-perfect example because it's built more around suspense than destruction. Sarah O'Connor escaping confinement, believing for one brief moment that she's free, only to turn the corner and suddenly find herself face to face with Thea T-800 again. That moment still works flawlessly. Then the T-1000 appears behind her and instantly the attention shifts all over again. That's one of Cameron's greatest strengths throughout the film. He constantly changes the flavor of the action. Sometimes it's explosive spectacle, sometimes it's suspense, sometimes it's a pure pursuit. The movie continually evolves its energy instead of repeating identical beats. Even the Zabardast assault feels completely different from the earlier action sequences. That section carries heavier emotional weight because now the characters are actively trying to prevent Judgment Day rather than merely survive it. You've got SWAT teams, shattered glass, miniguns, exploding police vehicles. Underneath all of it, there's a desperation now, and somehow the movie still finds room for unforgettable moments within the chaos. Arnold reloading the shotgun one-handed, Willie riding the Harley, the T-1000 sprinting after vehicles like exhaustion it doesn't exist for him, Sarah leaning out of moving cars, firing rifles, Thea helicopter flying beneath the bridge during the freeway pursuit, which honestly still feels insane every single time you watch it. Seriously, every time that sequence happens, part of my brain still thinks there's no way Thea actually did that, and the answer is they kind of did. That practical stunt work is a huge reason the action still feels alive today. There's real machinery colliding on screen, real explosions, real momentum. The movie understands physical weight in a way many CGI-heavy action films no longer do. And then there's the steel mill climax. Honestly, what I love about the finale is that it doesn't simply escalate into larger explosions for the sake of escalation. The environment itself matters. Heat chains, molten steel, massive industrial machinery. The setting transforms into this mechanical nightmare where every surface feels dangerous. The T-1000 becomes especially terrifying during the final act because the damage finally begins affecting him in unpredictable ways. He's glitching, morphing uncontrollably, becoming unstable. The spectacle is directly tied to the story instead of existing separately from it. That's important because Cameron never treats action as filler. Every major sequence changes something emotionally or narratively. The characters become more desperate, more exhausted, more vulnerable as the movie progresses. Even the quieter action moments carry a meaning. Take the scene where the T-800 lowers his weapon because John tells him not to take lives. That a small moral adjustment completely changes how the action functions moving forward. Suddenly, the confrontations have become less about destruction and more about survival. And honestly, the pacing of the spectacle is kind of genius. Cameron knows exactly when to accelerate and exactly when to let the audience breathe for a moment. If the movie stayed at maximum intensity non-stop, it would become exhausting. Instead, he spaces the action carefully, so each sequence feels like escalation rather than noise. By the end, the film has delivered motorcycles, trucks, helicopters, SWAT assaults, machine gun firefights, molten steel, explosions, enhanced hand machine combat, and somehow, it never feels bloated. That's difficult to achieve. A lot of giant action movies become louder as the progress but less exciting because the spectacle loses shape. They became film history moments. Even people who haven't watched it closely can usually identify those images immediately. That's cultural permanence. And what's interesting is that for all the technological innovation and giant-scale filmmaking, The thing that probably cemented the movie forever was the emotional core underneath all of it. The relationship between John and the T-800 gave audiences something human to hold onto inside all the spectacle. Without that, maybe the movie becomes an impressive technical achievement from the 1990s. With it, the film became timeless. That's the difference. A movie can revolutionize visual effects for a few years. Very few movies remain emotionally alive for decades. The strange thing about the Terminator franchise after it was that almost every sequel feels like it's trying to answer the same impossible question. How would you continue a story that already felt complete? Because honestly, Terminator 2 ends with so much emotional and thematic closure that continuing beyond it almost feels unnatural. The antagonist is destroyed. Judgment Day might finally be prevented. The Terminator sacrifices himself. Sarah Connor finally allows herself a little hope for the future. It feels finished, not franchise finished, obviously. Hollywood would never leave something this successful alone, but emotionally finished. Cameron very clearly approached to as the conclusion of a story, not the midpoint of an endless cinematic universe. And I think that's why every movie afterwards struggled in different ways. Now, to be fair, not every post-Hitler film is terrible. Some are genuinely entertaining. A few even contain interesting ideas buried inside them, but none of them fully escaped the shadow of those first two Cameron films. And that shadow is enormous. Terminator 3. Rise of the Machines is probably the clearest example of this strange franchise problem. On one hand, it's entertaining. Arnold still has presence, several of the action sequences work well, and honestly, the ending takes a surprisingly dark direction that I appreciate more now than I did years ago. But the movie also feels trapped with trying to imitate Hitler without fully understanding why Hitler worked emotionally. It has the shape of a Terminator movie, pursuits, a new advanced Terminator, callback dialogue, large explosions, but something underneath feels missing. The emotional weight isn't the same. The dread isn't the same. It feels more like a studio continuation than a story Cameron urgently needed to tell. Then you get a Terminator Salvation, which honestly deserves credit simply for attempting something different. That movie finally says, enough time travel. Let's actually stay in the future war. And honestly, that's an idea fans had wanted for years. Parts of Salvation actually have an interesting atmosphere, too. Burned out wastelands, machine warfare, humanity barely surviving. There are moments where you can feel the film reaching for something darker and more desperate, but again, it never fully lands emotionally the way the first two films did. A lot of viewers walked away thinking that was decent rather than that was essential, and that's kind of been the recurring challenge for the franchise. After Titweb, the sequels often feel like variations of familiar material instead of films creating an identity powerful enough to stand beside Cameron's work. Then came Terminator Genesis, which honestly feels like the franchise attempting to reboot itself while simultaneously remixing its own nostalgia. Alternate timelines, younger versions of familiar characters. Classic scenes recreated through a different lens. It's basically the Terminator franchise performing continuity gymnastics. Some viewers enjoy the sheer chaos of the approach, others are completely disconnected from it. But again, the movie spends so much energy referencing earlier Terminator films so that it struggles to feel entirely confident as its own identity. And then there's Dark Fate, which was especially interesting because James Cameron actually returned creatively in a producer role, and the marketing heavily emphasized the idea that this was the real continuation after Titwell. Bringing Linda Hamilton back was honestly one of the smartest decisions that movie made. The second Sarah Connor appears on screen again, You instantly remember how important she was to the emotional soul of the franchise, and Dark Fate absolutely has moments where you can feel that older energy trying to return. The action works. Some of the ideas are genuinely solid. Hamilton still completely commands the screen. But even there, the movie can't fully escape the gravitational pull of Terminator 2. It constantly reminds you of the earlier films because the identity of the franchise became permanently tied to those original Cameron stories. And that's the difficult part. The first two Terminator films weren't simply a successful franchise entries. They became defining science fiction landmarks. Once that happens, every continuation afterward gets judged against almost impossible standards automatically. And honestly, I think a part of the challenge is that the franchise concept itself becomes strangely limiting over time. There are only so many times audiences can watch. An advanced Terminator travels back through time, and the Resistance sends a protector to stop it. The pursuit begins, and eventually, the formula becomes clear. The first movie made the concept terrifying. The second made it emotional, epic, and almost mythic. After that, many of the later sequels began to feel more like rearrangements of familiar ideas than meaningful evolutions of the concept itself. That is why audiences continually return to James Cameron's originals. Not simply because of nostalgia, but because the two films genuinely complement each other so perfectly. The first movie is the nightmare. The second is the emotional epic. Together, they feel almost complete, as if the franchise never truly needed additional chapters. And honestly, that isn't necessarily an insult to the later films. It is more a reflection of how difficult it is to follow something that had already reached such a rare cultural level. Most franchises would consider themselves incredibly fortunate to create even one film as influential as The Terminator or Terminator 2. This series produced two. That is why even the weaker sequels remain part of the conversation. People keep coming back because the core concept is still incredibly powerful. Machines hunting humanity. Fate, technology, and survival. There is always potential in those ideas. When Cameron's first two films set the bar so high that every sequel afterward feels like it is chasing ghosts, trying to recapture lightning that had already struck twice. At the end of the day, Terminator 2, Judgment Day is one of those movies that almost feels too big to summarize completely because, depending on who you are, it can become a completely different experience. For some people, it is the ultimate action movie. For others, it is peak science fiction. Some watch it for its groundbreaking visual effects. Others come for Arnold Schwarzenegger at the height of his movie star presence. Some are drawn to Sarah Connor's transformation, while others connect with the emotional father-son relationship between John and the T-800. And honestly, plenty of viewers probably walked in expecting explosions and walked out unexpectedly emotional after the ending. That is the genius of the film. It works on multiple levels without ever feeling like it is desperately trying to prove its importance. What impresses me most when revisiting it today is how confidently it was made. Cameron directs the movie like someone who knows he is creating something enormous, yet he never loses control of it. The pacing remains sharp, the action is easy to follow, the emotional moments still land. Even the enormous spectacle, which could easily have overwhelmed everything else, continues to serve the story rather than replace it. That balance is incredibly rare, especially in blockbuster filmmaking. Many huge movies either become emotionally empty or collapse beneath the weight of their own ambition. Terminator 2 somehow avoids both problems. It is enormous, loud, emotional, funny, dark, hopeful, violent, and surprisingly heartfelt, yet it still feels focused.